Red Canyon, Wyoming Territory, October 1887. When Sheriff Thomas Garrett's wife vanished on a Sunday morning with a drifter named Jack Colter, the town expected scandal. What they got instead was silence, the kind that stretches across empty prairie and never breaks. 2 weeks later, a riderless horse returned with blood on the saddle. No bodies were ever found, but the truth carved itself into the canyon walls, written in the language of violence, betrayal, and the unforgiving nature of choices made in desperation. Some disappearances are mysteries. Others are warnings. Chapter 1. The Sunday She Vanished. October brought cold mornings to Red Canyon, Wyoming Territory, the kind where frost painted window panes white and breath hung visible in still air. Sunday, October 16th, 1887, started like any other Sabbath. Church bells ringing across the settlement, families gathering in their finest clothes, and Sheriff Thomas Garrett preparing for another week of maintaining order in a town that rarely needed much maintaining. Catherine Garrett had been unusually quiet that morning. Thomas noticed it while buttoning his vest, watching her reflection in the small mirror above their wash basin. She moved through their bedroom with methodical precision, folding clothes that didn't need folding, straightening objects already straight. Her dark hair, normally braided and pinned with care, hung loose down her back. When he asked if she felt unwell, she simply smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and told him she needed air. The church service proceeded without incident. Reverend Morrison delivered his sermon on redemption while the congregation shifted on hard wooden pews. Thomas sat in his usual spot, third row from the front, his badge catching occasional sunlight through the stained glass. Catherine's absence went unnoticed at first. She often claimed headaches, and the townspeople had grown accustomed to seeing the sheriff attend services alone. By noon, when Thomas returned home, the house felt different. Not ransacked or disturbed, but emptied in a way that suggested intention rather than chaos. Her dresses still hung in the wardrobe, but small things were missing. The photograph of her mother, the silver locket her father gave her, the worn Bible with pressed flowers between its pages. The kind of items a person takes when they're not planning to return. In the kitchen, he found a plate of biscuits covered with cloth, still warm. She'd baked that morning, had gone through the familiar motions of preparing his meal before walking away from their life together. The cruelty of that domesticity, of being fed before being abandoned, struck him harder than any blow he'd taken in 10 years of wearing a badge. Deputy Miller arrived around 2 o'clock, summoned by Thomas's grim expression. Together, they questioned neighbors who'd seen nothing unusual. Red Canyon was small enough that strangers stood out, yet no one reported seeing Catherine leave. It wasn't until young Billy Thompson mentioned the cowboy at the livery stable that pieces began forming a terrible picture. Jack Colter had drifted into town 3 weeks earlier, the kind of man who carried his entire life in saddlebags and asked no questions that might require him to answer any in return. He'd taken work at the Harrison Ranch, mending fences and breaking horses, earning just enough to pay for whiskey and a boarding house bed. Thomas had spoken to him twice, once when he first arrived, and again when he'd broken up a card game that had grown too heated. Nothing about Colter suggested danger. He stood average height with sun-weathered skin and hands scarred from rope and leather. He spoke little, drank moderately, and caused no trouble. The kind of man who passed through settlements like wind through grass, leaving no lasting impression. But someone at the livery remembered seeing Catherine that morning, remembered her speaking quietly with Colter near the stalls. They'd left together on horseback, she on her gray mare, he on his roan gelding, riding west toward the canyon country where rock formations rose like cathedral walls and water ran scarce, even in good seasons. Thomas stood in the livery stable's dusty interior, staring at the empty stall where Catherine's mare had been kept. His wife had left him for a drifter, had planned her departure carefully enough to pack necessities and bacon biscuits, had chosen a Sunday morning when the town would be distracted by worship. The humiliation burned worse than the heartbreak initially. A lawman's wife running off with a cowboy. The story would spread through the territory like wildfire. But beneath the wounded pride, something darker stirred. Catherine had been unhappy, yes, but not reckless. She planned carefully, moved through life with deliberate caution. Running away with a near stranger in a harsh country didn't match the woman he'd lived with for 7 years. As the afternoon sun stretched shadows long across the canyon walls, Thomas assembled a search party. 6 men, all experienced trackers, all armed and provisioned for several days in rough country. They would leave at first light, following the trail west into the labyrinth of stone and sage where Catherine and Jack Colter had disappeared together. That night, Thomas sat alone in the house that no longer felt like home. He didn't sleep, didn't eat the biscuits she'd left him. Instead, he studied the empty spaces where her belongings had been, trying to read meaning into absence. Outside, wind tested the windows and mourned through the eaves, carrying the scent of coming snow and the promise of harder days ahead. Chapter 2. Blood on the Saddle. Dawn broke cold and colorless over Red Canyon on Monday morning. Thomas and his search party rode out while most of the settlement still slept, their breath mingling with their horses' exhalations in the frigid air. Deputy Miller rode beside Thomas, along with Pete Harrison from the ranch where Colter had worked, Jim Crawford the tracker, and 3 other men whose skills made them valuable in country that forgave no mistakes. The trail led west as expected, following the established route into the canyonlands before diverging onto narrower paths used mainly by deer and mountain sheep. Jim Crawford dismounted frequently, studying hoof prints in dust and disturbed stones, reading the landscape like other men read newspapers. 2 horses, he confirmed, traveling at moderate pace. No signs of struggle or urgency. By midday, they'd covered 15 miles, winding through corridors of redstone that rose hundreds of feet on either side. The land here belonged more to geology than humanity, ancient stone carved by wind and water into impossible formations. Juniper trees clung to slopes while ravens circled overhead, their harsh calls echoing off canyon walls. Thomas rode in grim silence, his jaw set against thoughts he couldn't stop from forming. What had Catherine said to Colter during those 3 weeks? What promises had been made in stolen moments? The questions gnawed at him, but he forced his attention back to the trail, to the practical matter of finding 2 people in country vast enough to swallow them completely. They camped that night beneath an overhang, building a small fire that threw dancing shadows on stone walls. The men spoke little, understanding that Thomas needed silence more than conversation. In the distance, a coyote sang to the rising moon. Tuesday brought them deeper into the maze. The trail grew harder to follow as rocky ground left fewer prints. Around mid-afternoon, they found the first campsite, a fire ring still containing cold ashes, 2 distinct sleeping areas pressed in a sandy soil beneath a sheltering rock face. Thomas studied those sleeping impressions, seeing in their separation a detail that shifted something in his understanding. They'd slept apart, maintaining distance even in wilderness isolation. It suggested formality rather than passion, transaction rather than romance. Wednesday morning arrived with high clouds threatening weather. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and wind carried the smell of distant snow. The search party pushed harder, aware that if a storm came through, any remaining trail would be obliterated completely. Around noon, while following a narrow defile between towering rock walls, they found the horse. Catherine's gray mare stood in a small clearing beside a seep spring, reins trailing, saddle askew. The animal nickered at their approach, clearly exhausted despite the available water. As they drew closer, Thomas saw what made his blood run cold. Dark stains on the saddle, dried to brown but unmistakably blood. Not a small amount, either, but enough to suggest serious injury. The men dismounted quickly, examining the area with renewed urgency. Jim Crawford found drag marks in the dust, leading from the clearing toward a jumble of boulders 50 yards distant. The track showed one person being pulled or dragged, their boot heels scoring the earth, accompanied by another set of prints, a man's boots, moving with purpose but not running. Thomas followed those drag marks with his heart hammering against his ribs. Behind the boulder cluster, they found more blood, a considerable amount pooled in the dust, along with torn fabric that matched the blue dress Catherine had been wearing. But no body, no sign of Catherine herself, only evidence of violence and the disturbing absence of remains. Colter's tracks led away from the scene, moving fast now, almost running. They followed them for another mile before losing the trail completely on bare rock. The cowboy had vanished as thoroughly as Catherine, leaving behind only mysteries written in blood and boot prints. As darkness fell, Thomas sat apart from the others, staring into the fire and beautiful night sky, trying to construct a narrative that made sense. Catherine's blood on the saddle, drag marks, her body missing. Colter fled. It suggested murder, but why? What had happened between them in these lonely canyons? That night, lying in his bedroll beneath stars that offered no comfort, Thomas confronted a truth he'd been avoiding. He'd failed Catherine long before she left. Failed to see her unhappiness. Failed to ask the right questions. Whatever had brought her to this end, he bore some measure of responsibility. The knowledge settled in his chest like stone, cold and permanent. Chapter 3. What the Canyon Kept. Thursday brought the storm they'd feared. Snow swirling sideways through the canyons, turning redstone white and obliterating any remaining traces. By Friday, with supplies running low and conditions worsening, Thomas made the decision to return to Red Canyon. They'd found Catherine's horse, found blood and signs of violence, but the land had claimed its secrets. The ride back took 3 days through snow that transformed familiar landscape into alien territory. They arrived in Red Canyon on Monday afternoon, 8 days after Catherine had vanished, carrying news that satisfied no one. The town received their report with the peculiar disappointment of people denied a clear ending. Thomas resumed his duties with mechanical efficiency, enforcing laws in a settlement that watched him with barely concealed pity. He moved through the house he'd shared with Catherine. Her belongings remained untouched. He couldn't bring himself to pack them away, couldn't admit finality to her absence. Weeks passed into months. November brought harder cold, while December buried the territory under snow. Red Canyon settled into winter routine, and slowly the story of a sheriff's missing wife faded from daily conversation, becoming history rather than gossip. Then, in late February, a trapper named Moses Sweet arrived in town with a story that changed everything. He'd spent the winter in the high country, checking trap lines in territory most men considered too remote for viable hunting. In a narrow canyon 20 miles beyond where the search party had turned back, he'd found something disturbing. Bones scattered by scavengers, scraps of clothing, and 2 graves marked with stones arranged with deliberate care. Thomas rode out immediately with Deputy Miller and Moses Sweet, despite the bitter cold. They traveled for 2 days through deep snow, following the trapper's directions into country Thomas had never explored. The canyon Moses described was little more than a crack in the earth, accessible only through a treacherous descent that required leading horses single file down a rock face more suitable for goats than men. At the canyon's bottom, sheltered from wind and hidden from casual view, they found what remained. 2 graves, marked with carefully stacked stones and crude crosses fashioned from juniper branches. Nearby lay bones scattered by animals and weather, along with items Moses had found: a boot with distinctive stitching, a belt buckle, scraps of cloth in blue fabric and brown leather. They opened the graves carefully, reverently, uncovering what winter and scavengers had left behind. The first grave held remains that would later be identified as Jack Colter. The second grave contained Catherine Garrett, or what remained of her. Both had been buried with care, their bodies arranged with respect. But it was what Thomas found near the graves that completed the story: a leather-bound journal, protected from weather by its placement beneath a rock overhang. The journal belonged to Catherine, and its pages told a truth far different from the scandal the town had imagined. Reading her words in that cold canyon, Thomas learned what had really happened. Catherine had been dying, a growth in her chest that caused pain she'd hidden, that left her coughing blood into handkerchiefs she'd concealed from her husband. She'd consulted a doctor in Cheyenne during a trip Thomas thought was to visit her sister. The prognosis had been unambiguous. Months at best, painful and deteriorating, ending in a kind of death that destroyed not just the dying, but everyone forced to witness their decline. Catherine hadn't wanted that for Thomas. Hadn't wanted him to watch her waste away, to sacrifice his life caring for her dying. She'd sought a different ending, one of her own choosing, and had found in Jack Colter an unexpected ally. Colter, it turned out, had been dying too. Consumption that had hollowed his lungs and stolen his strength. Catherine had recognized the signs, had approached him with a proposition that must have seemed insane, that they disappear together into the canyon country and find their endings on their own terms. The journal described their journey with surprising detail. Catherine wrote of long conversations with Jack, of discovering in him a kindred spirit facing the same terrible choice. They'd ridden west, not as lovers, but as companions in mortality. Two people choosing dignity over pity. Her last entries, written in increasingly shaky handwriting, described the final days. Her condition had worsened faster than expected. The blood on the saddle had been hers, coughed up in hemorrhages she could no longer control. Jack had helped her from her horse when she could no longer ride, had carried her to the sheltered canyon, had made her as comfortable as circumstances allowed. She died first, peacefully according to her own words, watching stars through the canyon opening. Jack had buried her carefully, marking her grave, then settled down to wait for his own death, which came less than a week later. Before the end, he'd written a brief note explaining what Thomas would find, apologizing for the deception, and confirming that Catherine had died as she'd wished, free from pity, master of her own end. Chapter 4. The Truth We Choose. Thomas stood in that hidden canyon for a long time after reading Catherine's journal, his eyes fixed on the graves. The cold bit through his coat, but he barely felt it. Everything he believed about Catherine's disappearance had been wrong. The scandal, the betrayal, the imagined romance. She hadn't abandoned him out of dissatisfaction. She'd left to protect him from watching her die. The cruelty of that kindness staggered him. She'd chosen to let him believe she'd run away with another man rather than burden him with her terminal illness. She'd accepted becoming a cautionary tale, had allowed him to suffer humiliation and heartbreak, had trusted that eventually the truth would emerge and he would understand. Deputy Miller stood nearby, uncertainty written across his face. What they did next would determine how Red Canyon remembered this story. They could return with the truth, show the journal, explain the terminal illnesses, reveal Catherine's sacrifice. Or they could maintain the fiction, let the town keep its scandal. Thomas made his decision quickly. They would bring Catherine home, bury her properly in the town's cemetery with her real name on the headstone. But the journal would remain private, its contents known only to Thomas and those who'd accompanied him. Some truths were too personal for public consumption. As for Jack Colter, Thomas arranged for his burial beside Catherine in that sheltered canyon. The man had honored his commitment to a dying woman, had shown more compassion and courage than most people managed in comfortable circumstances. He deserved to rest where he'd chosen, marked and remembered, even if only by wind and stone. They returned to Red Canyon in early March with Catherine's remains and a story that satisfied the town's need for conclusion without revealing its deepest truths. Thomas told them she'd died in the canyons, that Colter had buried her before succumbing to his own consumption. The town accepted this narrative, creating its own embellishments as towns always do. Thomas buried Catherine on a hillside overlooking the settlement, with a simple headstone bearing her name and dates. He visited the grave regularly, speaking to her in ways he hadn't when she'd been alive, telling her things he wished he'd said when words might have made a difference. In time, Red Canyon's story of a sheriff's wife who left on a Sunday became legend, simplified and distorted with each retelling until truth and fiction blended into something neither accurate nor entirely false. But Thomas kept Catherine's journal, reading her words on difficult nights when memory proved stronger than sleep. He learned to live with what had happened, though forgiveness, both of her, and himself, came slowly. Catherine had tried to spare him pain, but had only transformed it into a different kind of suffering. Yet in her final writings, he found something resembling peace. She'd loved him enough to leave, had trusted him enough to believe he would eventually understand. Years later, when Thomas finally retired, he rode out to that hidden canyon one last time. He found a grave still marked, still tended by no one but weather and time. He left flowers he'd carried for 2 days, placed them on the stones marking Catherine and Jack Colter, and spoke words of gratitude to a man he'd once considered his enemy. Some stories don't have simple endings. Some people disappear into wilderness, carrying truths too complex for easy understanding. Catherine Garrett left town on a Sunday morning with a dying cowboy, seeking a death of her own choosing. They never came back because they never intended to, because sometimes the greatest act of love is leaving before becoming a burden too heavy for others to carry. The canyon kept their secrets until it didn't. And Thomas Garrett lived the rest of his life knowing that the worst day of his life, the day his wife vanished, had also been an act of profound sacrifice, misunderstood and unappreciated until revelation arrived wrapped in leather and written in a dying woman's hand. If this story of complicated love and impossible choices moved you, consider what endings we choose for ourselves and what stories we tell to protect those we leave behind. Sometimes the truth arrives too late to change anything except how we remember what we lost.